Chapel and to those who have joined us through the live stream. I'm Joshua Smith, Associate Professor of Mechanical Engineering and the Clerk of the Faculty. Each day of this Inauguration Week has been focused on a theme, with yesterday's events geared towards students, this lecture today for the faculty, and tomorrow's United Way Day of Service for the community, all leading up to Friday's installation of Dr. Nicole Hurd as our 18th president. In serving on the Inauguration Steering Committee and thinking about an event that would appeal to the faculty, I shared that I'm personally moved by President Hurd's work with the College Advising Corps, for which she was the founder and CEO, further work to increase the number of low-income, first-generation, and underrepresented students who enter college and earn a degree. This resonates significantly to me due to my service as a posse mentor to 2 different posses over the past 7 years, and also with the efforts that Lafayette has been making over the past several years to recruit students from underrepresented groups. Our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Eric Bettinger, an associate professor of the economics of education in Stanford's Graduate School of Education, will speak to these issues of access and education. President Hurd will make a more formal introduction of Dr. Bettinger, and then we'll lead a conversation with him on these topics. Tonight's format will allow for some interactive discussion. We will open the floor later in the program to those in the audience to ask questions. We also have a Qualtrics survey online where questions can be submitted from those watching the live stream. This survey is on the college's inauguration page where the live stream was found. Now please join me in welcoming Lafayette's 18th president, Dr. Nicole Hurd and Dr. Eric Bettinger.
Thank you, Josh. Josh has been one of the people that has made Lafayette home in a really beautiful way. So Josh, thank you for your friendship and your mentorship, for welcoming me so warmly and to serving on the steering committee and bringing us all here tonight. I am so excited to be here. I have a couple of things to share as I introduce Eric. And by the way, we've been masked up. We are both fully vaccinated. We're going to stay 6 feet away, but we're unmasked because we're live streaming this, and you can't hear us if we keep the masks on. So please, everybody know I'm complying, and so is Eric. We're just doing this because of the live stream. As soon as it's over, we'll put our masks back on since we're inside. So I had an experience today that I had not had in a year and a half, which was, and I know a lot of you have felt this way, you have a colleague, you have somebody who makes you better. That's the best kind of colleague, right, is the one that lifts you up and makes you even better at your work than you would be otherwise. And sometimes those colleagues are at other institutions. I'm sure a lot of faculty can resonate with that thought. Somebody who makes me better at my work is our professor of economics over here, my friend Eric Bettinger. He absolutely makes me better at everything we've done together. He's at Stanford, and I have not hugged you in a year and a half because of COVID. So I got to hug Eric today, which means that this inauguration week is already getting better and better. But Eric, welcome to Lafayette.
Well, thank you so much.
So I'm going to explain how Eric and I met, and then we're going to have a conversation about access and success and diversity and inclusion. Might throw in some athletics. We might throw in some, I don't know, endowment, whatever you want to talk about. We know all those things from the work you do. So, but let me tell everybody how Eric and I first met. So, as you all know, I spent the last 14 years running an organization called the College Advising Corps. This was a brainchild of mine when I was at the University of Virginia. A colleague of both of ours, another economist, Sarah Turner, said to me when we started the College Advising Corps program, do not mess this up. She actually used a different word. Make sure you evaluate immediately. Make sure you get somebody who's really good at evaluation, because what most nonprofits don't do is think about that, and we'll talk about it, the virtuous cycle of kind of innovation and learning and reflecting and feeding that loop, which is something you've taught me profoundly over the last 14 years. And so we started to look for an evaluator for the College Advising Corps when we got a $10 million grant from the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation to go national. And our first evaluator, I'm going to tell the story, was not very user-friendly. They thought that they knew better than all of our practitioners and really kind of didn't hit us in the right direction in terms of the work. And so we had to do another RFP to find another evaluator. And I had a former student, Brent Evans, who had been my student at the University of Virginia, and now he was off at Stanford as Eric's student. And I called Brent and said, Eric is a rock star. Do you think he'll look at this RFP? I need to make sure the evaluation goes well. He said, I'll ask him. I get a call saying, Eric will not look at it because he wants to apply himself. And so next thing you know, Eric had applied through this RFP to become our external evaluator, and our journey had begun. And so I can think we have applied to multiple grants together. There's been a couple IES grants. There's been some SIF, Social Innovation Funding, we had during the Obama administration. So we've spent many a night comparing notes. Again, I'm sure all our faculty colleagues understand what that feels like. But when I met Eric, we had about 14 advisors serving roughly 2,000 students. When I left the College Advising Corps in June, we had over 800 advisors serving about 240,000 students, and we had helped 525,000 students go to college, and you were one that validated all that. So before I say anything else, Eric is the kind of faculty member that helps a practitioner and another faculty member not only be better, but be more impactful. So I will never be able to thank you enough. Again, colleagues, if you could welcome Eric Bettinger to Lafayette.
I always joke that when I die, I really want Nicole to write my eulogy, because she says it so poetically. She makes it sound as if, she makes it sound as if I did all the work. But the reality was, as we started to kind of work together, what was amazing was the resiliency of the organization to repeatedly look at themselves and try to make a decision about how they were doing and how they could do it better. And I think that that's one of the most difficult things across the board. As soon as we start doing something that we think it works, we have a tendency to shy away from evaluating it and figuring out why it works, or even figuring out whether it still works as circumstances change. And one of the great things about working with the organization was the way that the organization bought in that evaluating where they're at, thinking about where they're at, trying to make themselves better was going to be one of the things that was just cultural. And so it's easy to work with an organization that's like that. What's hard is I've worked with other organizations that oftentimes want you to come in, they want measurement. If it doesn't look like the way that they wanted it to, they really try to find a way to shut the door as quickly as possible on that part of the conversation. And so that was one of the things that was just really fun to work with you on.
Well, I will lean on my new colleagues here to help make sure that we evaluate what we do at Lafayette and make sure that we invest wisely. But I think you and I share, and I know my colleagues here share, this belief that evaluation is not judgment, it's learning, right? And if you don't evaluate, then how are you learning? And how do you know that you're learning? So.
Well, and I think that was one of the hardest parts. I remember one time we were running a randomized control trial in Texas, and the first year the results looked really good. And then the second year, the results, they were still good, but by the third year, the results basically, there didn't look like there was a difference between the treatment and control groups. And I remember breaking the news to the program directors, and they cried. And they cried because they thought oftentimes that evaluation was akin to judgment. And now the judgment was, and it turned out there were some interesting things going on. What had happened was our control group in this particular randomized experiment, they had applied to get the College Advising Corps to come to their schools. And in that lottery, we only had a certain number of slots we could give. They had been randomly selected not to receive the College Advising Corps, at least for a couple of years, and then they could reapply. But they were undaunted. They wanted the help. And so they went and found other programs. And so if you actually look at those other programs, in the first year, the control group really didn't have many opportunities. By the second year, everybody had found something to go in there. And so as a result, it was when you looked at kind of from a distance, you could see that all of the schools, both inside the experiment, receiving the treatment and the control, both of them had started to really accelerate. But that acceleration happened with the College Advising Corps immediately, whereas those others, they had to go find those programs. So there's a good explanation, but the hard part was, that sometimes looking at it as a judgment. And that's one of the hardest parts, I think, when you're doing evaluation and working with an outside organization, helping them understand it's okay to have bad numbers every once in a while, but then you need to understand the context and potentially why we actually see what we have. And trying to look through the different lenses can actually provide, tremendous insight into the organization itself.
Yeah. Well, I remember having a couple conversations with you about Eric, I've got good news. We've got somebody that wants to give us millions of dollars. We're fundraising. The bad news is they want to put the advisors in control schools. So guess what? Your sample size just shrunk. So yes, there was all sorts of kind of interesting forces. The other thing, and I want this to kind of apply to our colleagues here in a second, so I'm going to pivot in a minute, but again, what I love about you, Eric, is you make me better, which is what good colleagues do, but you also were willing to point things out. I'll never forget, you called me one night and you said, Nicole, I'm looking at the data. So the running joke, I have a PhD in religious studies. Obviously, Eric has a PhD in economics. The running joke was that he ran the regressions and I prayed about the regressions. So he called me one night to tell me maybe I should pray a little harder because, no, but he said, look, I know how you want to make sure that we have as much impact as possible. I'm looking at the data. And what was cool is we worked together so long that we had a lot of longitudinal data, and we were doing surveys year over year over year where we could really compare. And what you noticed, and I think this is interesting for the Lafayette family to think about, is we noticed that if you're a first-generation college student, your biggest influencer on where you were going to college or if you're going to college was your parents. And that was true if you weren't first gen. And I think we all thought, well, if you're first gen, then you're going to go to somebody else. You're going to go to your school counselor. You're going to go to somebody you know that went to college. But it was the parents, even for first generation college graduates or college students. And so you said to me, you're never going to have the impact that you want to have unless you start doing parent outreach. Like we've got to get, and I'm looking at my colleagues from admissions and enrollment management right now. They're all shaking their heads going, yes, you have to talk to parents. But you called me and said, we're never going to have the impact that you want unless we start doing parent work. You were spot on because our work got much better once we started doing family engagement. But you also made us better at that moment, and I was very grateful for it. So you want to talk about how do parents and families, as we think about supporting first-generation students on this campus, what does the data say there, Eric?
Well, so maybe let me back up and let's just give the context on that conversation. Because one of the things we've been doing is one of the hard things is if you want to improve something, one of the first things you need to actually be able to do is measure what's going on around it. If you can't actually look inside the box, it's hard to see anything. And we'd been surveying students for a period of time, trying to get a better idea of who they were talking to, what they were talking to people about. And so the first stage was this data collection. And when you looked at kind of the intentionality around school, you found that it was predicted by any number of conversations with counselors, parents, peers, teachers. But what really stood out for us, one of the things we were doing was we were also kind of tracking the outcomes and trying to link that back. And when we looked at what was predictive of attending college, the only conversation that mattered was with parents. And it was just such a powerful thing that, I mean, it's colored the way that I think about research. It's not just that it changed the organization in some ways, it also just changed since I have a number of projects where I'm trying to reach out to parents in different contexts because of that role that they play in that decision making. When we started that, one of the things then that turns is then how do you actually engage in something that you're not good at? And I think that was one of the places where then you move from this kind of place, I wouldn't say comfort, because when you're doing evaluative work and thinking about yourself, it's never comfortable. But then you go to this place where you might be able to take a risk and trying to think about where can we take the risk and what kind of risks do we want to take. And so one of the things we started to do is we started to try different programs. We tried some text message campaigns with different parents. We tried ways to invite parents in to actually meet. We tried different nights where we would try to like FAFSA nights and other things where we tried to get parents. And what was fun was then it was no longer about evaluating an organization. It was about trying to think about what are the truly innovative ways to get parents into the conversation. So sometimes, at some point in that, about that same time, we started kind of dividing some of the work that we were doing into those things that were helping us understand the core and those things that were about innovation. And so one of the kind of meaningful places is getting to that point where you're willing to take risks together. And have we figured it out? I don't know that we figured it out completely. I mean, actually, COVID helped us on this front. We had more parent engagement during COVID than we'd ever had, in part because suddenly virtual meetings were part of their repertoire or their routine, so to speak. And as you start to think about it, that's the other place where we've struggled and one of the things that I think College Advising Corps was trying to figure out, but I think when I say we, I mean higher education, the US trying to figure out is how to assimilate students. We're getting better at getting students in the door. And the question is, can we get them not just through the door, but really let them be successful? And if we were having a pure conversation on that, well, I know we're going to talk about it as some, we'll find that it's about as black boxy as getting students to actually have that conversation about going. Because sometimes, for example, today I actually taught my class. I did everything remotely today. It was kind of like this, well, we're veterans at this. We've done Zoom for a long time. But one of the things that we were talking about today is what type of cost do students experience in going to college that aren't monetary costs, that are those kind of non-monetary costs. And I had a number of my students at Stanford who talked about the barriers that they faced as undergraduates. Like one of my students grew up in New York, had very little access to information, did not have the kind of support, and while his parents were supportive of him going to school, they just didn't have the answers. And the role of groups and individuals in the community in helping him understand what his options were, and then subsequently his decision to then take the risk, were quite important. But part of it is that I think our students, we don't appreciate altogether all the different challenges we face. And oftentimes our natural thing is to say, well, many of these come from kind of disadvantaged low-income backgrounds, so what we almost want to do is somehow increase the money around them, when oftentimes it's not necessarily the money that's the issue. It might, in the end, be one of the issues that contributes, but that assimilation, that ability to come on campus, to feel like they're part of a community, to start to see success in their own lives as they start to get involved, those are one of the things that I think are very difficult for us in higher education.
Well, you're hitting on something that our colleague Tony Jack, right, about access is not inclusion, right? And so we've done a lot of work in the access space, and we still don't have perfect, right? There's a lot to work to still do, but we also have a lot of work to do on the inclusion side.
Yeah.
You're bringing up words that I hope my Lafayette family understand that I'm here to embrace, right? So having hard conversations, taking some risks, doing things differently, being willing to take some chances. We announced yesterday with the faculty, and we'll announce to the public soon, and you've done a lot of work in this space. So you have a groundbreaking study on FAFSA completion and some other work. So you're a financial aid expert on top of all sorts of other things, but we're going to announce that we're getting rid of all loans for families that are making $150,000 or less. Now, I have not told you that until just now, so good idea, bad idea, we're already doing it, but, but I want to hear from the economists, like what do you think might happen to our applicant pool with that?
Well, let's just try to think a little bit, let's start backwards with what evidence we have. Probably the best study that's out there that has done this in the past looked at kind of what happened in terms of the career choice on the other side. So there's a study that basically looked at a large liberal arts college, or a large college on the East Coast, I can't really say which one, where they basically randomized whether students received loans or whether they received a grant that, at least in its present discounted value, was the same value. And one of the things in that study that was in that randomized control trial that was really interesting was the type of job students chose on the other side. The students who had debt felt obligated to get that debt paid off. People don't like to have debt, and many students are so uncomfortable with debt that it starts to change the way that they behave. And so as a result, the students who had debt, they were like, get me a job on Wall Street, get me something that's going to compensate me well, that I'm going to try to pay off those loans as quickly as possible. Let's try to find the place that's going to be as remunerative as possible. By contrast, the students who didn't have debt, some of them still looked for those types of jobs, but many of them were much more likely to enter public service type jobs. They were much more thinking about their community, thinking about the barriers that they'd faced, and trying to find jobs that would actually put them in a place where they could work on the front line on that barrier for future generations. And I say, as you think about where you want impact to happen on campus and where you want, part of our goal in higher education, it's not just to train our students in such a way that they're going to go out there and make the most amount of money ever, right? I think that some of the work that Clayton Christensen at Harvard, the late Clayton Christensen did, kind of, especially late in his life, he really emphasized, there's so much that you can do to help your community. There's so much you can do beyond earning money to bring happiness to you and those around you. And I think ultimately that's where we want to be. We want our students to be happy. We want them to be successful and well-rounded in their lives. And so as you start to think about debt, that's immediately one of the places you see that coming in. Now, as you start to rewind the clock even further back and start to think about the students that are coming on, I mean, one of the things that we see is a reluctance for students to take debt, just a tremendous reluctance. I sometimes, when I'm teaching, just tell my experience, which was, my dad was doing the best he could, but financially we struggled, and we actually ended up declaring bankruptcy at some point. And I remember as a kid being, when the guys in suits showed up and said our house wasn't ours anymore, and those heartbreaking moments in life. So as I thought about how I was going to go through college, I was terrified of debt. Debt leads to your house being taken away. I didn't understand that there were other issues in our budgeting and other things that contributed. What I just saw was this direct line between debt, losing what you have. And so as a result, in college, I would do everything. I was working 3 jobs to try to kind of make sure that I didn't have to enter debt. Now, I had some good scholarships that really helped me as well, but that debt aversion that we sometimes see in some groups is very, very tangible. And so one of the hard parts is, as we start to think about underrepresented groups who are worried about debt, the lifting of debt opens the doors and makes it to where it becomes a little bit more of the conversation. One of the things that you and I've talked about, and just kind of to bring the issue to everybody, is one of the things that we often struggled with was trying to understand how to advise a student who was afraid of debt, and their options were go to a school where they're going to have tremendous debt, but the school was fantastic, or go to a school that was closer to home, they weren't going to enter debt, and they'd probably be the best or the superstar at that campus. And that's a very hard deal. Which of those options is better for that particular student? Is it better to be the superstar at a local college, or is it better to have a debt load and be at a college where hopefully they're competitive, but that's a little bit of a stretch? And it was one of the things we struggled with in college advising corps to kind of know what the success rate. In fact, one of the things that was almost counterintuitive was many of the students who chose to stay at the local college were much more likely to complete college degrees than some of the other students who took tremendous debt out. When you take debt out of the equation, it starts to level that playing field, and suddenly the one that's far away doesn't have that debt burden as well. And so, it'll be an interesting experiment, and I hope that you're reflective about it, because I think one of the things you'll find as you start to go through it is as you look at how students behave, which students apply, it'll inform you more about some of the population, some of the students who come here, some of the students who are struggling and what they might be struggling with, and it might give you some other ideas how to help them as we go forward. Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer.
No. I mean, like I said, it's actually fascinating because I did not ask you that before we got here, and it's something I think we're all excited to do, but you've also reminded me, and I'll look at my enrollment management and admissions friends, we have to measure, we have to evaluate, we have to ask the hard questions. So we will do that here. Going to pivot a little bit. You're teaching, and like I said, I owe you a huge debt of gratitude, and so do my Lafayette colleagues. You were supposed to be teaching in person today. Stanford's back in person, and you're willing to come here and teach on Zoom. So sorry to your students that they had one more Zoom class when they didn't need to have one. But you're teaching the economics of education class this semester, and I hear you were talking about small liberal arts colleges and kind of what it's like to look at the economics of that space. So love to hear what you talked about in class, Eric, since we seem to be sitting at a liberal arts college that has an engineering division, but it's a place that might have been on the radar in some of your discussions, or at least schools like us. So what happened in class today, Eric?
Well, backing up a little bit, I always like to give a little bit more context here. I mean, So first off, this is not a place I've done research. So this is a place where I'm a little bit of a consumer of knowledge and not necessarily a producer. So take everything I say with a little bit of a grain of salt here, in that, one of the things that was highlighted, one of the things I do every day is I quickly go through the newspapers, and anything that's relevant for this, it's an economics of higher education class, I immediately post that up to our discussion board. And my students right now are just fantastic, and they like to talk about that, not necessarily on the discussion board, but at least in the classroom. And one of the things that happened was there was an announcement that a small liberal arts college that's located near Stanford, that Stanford was basically buying out their campus. And they would continue to exist in some, but a large part of their portfolio was being moved over to Stanford. And one of the things that we've been talking about with our students is I've been trying to talk to them about one of the hard parts about an institution is oftentimes they come into it and they think like I do, like faculty. And when as a faculty member, when I think about the campus, especially when I think about working at Stanford and the size of its endowment and everything, when Stanford charges me for each copy I make, I just kind of find myself going, what? Haven't we figured this out how to do this right? But at the same time, like I oftentimes don't see the predicament, and I don't think of higher education as being a business. And one of the things I love about this class is it talks about how higher educational institutions aren't necessarily, should we think of them more, Gordon Winston once said, should we think of them as churches or should we think of them as car salesmen? Or somewhere between there, right? And I think that it's kind of as you start to think about, going now to the economics of liberal arts colleges, one of the things that we find ourselves in is how do we think about revenue in this day and age? Oftentimes, our boards are very conservative about our endowments, and we for good reason, oftentimes try to limit what the payout looks like at that. At some campuses, that has become. It still makes up a sizable proportion of the actual revenues, but at other places, we're much more tuition dependent. And the more and more that we are tuition dependent, then as we start to think about swings in the market, it becomes very difficult. And as students and one of the things we've seen is an evolution of preferences around our students. Now, I don't know if it's an evolution of preferences, but we've seen a number of students want a college experience. It's not just that they're buying training that is going to help them get a job. They're buying a 4-year experience where they're going to be pushed in many different aspects of their lives. They're buying a place where they can be with other young adults who are going through the same thing and the fun that they're going to have. And one of the things we're seeing is in part of the market, we're seeing a shift away from that and a shift more towards the role of my education is really about subsequent employment. And so what happens is it's kind of pulling students towards either the top of that kind of hierarchy of colleges, or it's pulling students away from some of those. And so one of the things we're finding is that some of the small liberal arts colleges that are particularly dependent on tuition revenue, they're becoming vulnerable. So one of the hard parts is, I don't envy you, I'm grateful that you're doing this, but I'm glad that I get to study this and not do this, is that you have to play the role of being a champion of academic values, but also recognizing the reality that ultimately this is a business and that it can behave like a church, and we can have those great moments of learning and spirituality and of discovery, but at the end of the day, the revenues and the costs, you've got to have a balance there. And if your costs are going out of control or your revenues are starting to lag, you have to pay attention to where those come from. One of the institutions I was previously at before Stanford, we had a dean who really had this great idea. He wanted to vault us up into the upper echelons of rankings. And so what we did was we decided to reduce the size of our class tremendously. And we decided to basically make it so it was such a selective class that at least on the metric for ratings on kind of the average entry test score, we're going to be off the charts. Small problem. We are tuition dependent. And suddenly this school of management lost all of its revenue because when we cut our student body that much, we cut our revenue by that much, we didn't cut the costs. And we wound up in a situation where here we're teaching business, but we're not actually running a good business. And so I think that that's one of the hard parts, right? Is how do you be part of this world that almost you want to insulate from some of those business decisions, but yet how do you run it still and recognize that ultimately revenues and costs have to balance out or you're in trouble? Again, I'm giving you these long-winded answers.
No, it's great. I am aware that there's probably questions coming in, so you want us to keep going for a bit? Okay. All right, we're going to keep going. I get to monopolize you longer. let's talk about, I'm going to pivot again. Let's talk about one of the things that I know you have a lot of experience in is global education. So, we've got some amazing faculty here, a strong international affairs department, all sorts of good interdisciplinary things going on. But you've taught, matter of fact, you're teaching in Norway tomorrow morning, right?
I'm giving a seminar tomorrow morning in Norway.
What do you see kind of in that space? Again, it's interesting. We're coming back out of COVID. I think a lot of students are ready to think about studying abroad again. They're thinking about global engagement again. But when you think about kind of the higher ed space, and again, you've taught all over the world, what's the kind of cost benefit or the trade-off in that space when you look at it?
I mean, I think that one of the things, that analogy of the flat world, Friedman's analogy, I think is just, you see it so real. The quality of students in other places has increased tremendously. And as an example, as you start to think about how more and more of the best students in the entire world recognize that there's a value and that there's something unique about U.S. higher education, and they want to be a part of that. Now, that's not to detract from their home institutions. I think the quality of higher education in most countries has gone up tremendously over the last 2 decades. But there's something unique about the United States. Part of it is that we really fostered, almost a pyramid type shape in the way that we thought about education, whereas many of the other institutions out there, countries, had something that was kind of very bloated with maybe a small little needle coming up at the top with 1 or 2 institutions that were really elite and a number there was a lot of parity. But as students have wanted to move up that hierarchy and have had limited opportunities in their own country, they look to the U.S. And frankly, for many campuses, especially our public campuses, many of them are godsend in terms of revenue because they come in as full-paying student. They're a different source of revenue, and so you see many of our public institutions especially having a greater mix. But as you start to think a little bit about, kind of what happens with those students, the perspectives they bring, the way in which they really have different experiences they bring to the classroom. And one of the things that I'm a firm believer in, and there's a great research out there on it that demonstrates that peers are a big part of schooling. In fact, it's part of the thing that makes it fun economically because it's an odd thing where peers are the input, but the quality of student is also our output. So our inputs are our outputs. It's kind of a weird economics model, but with these international students, they bring in a different perspective and they really help. The other thing that happens though is as our U.S. institutions start to have an increased presence from international students, and we want that so we can get that global perspective with our students, it also makes it to where they're more competitive and worldwide. And it makes it to where as we start to think about conversations about diversity, conversations about really bringing in diverse voices, it's not just diverse voices in the U.S. that matters, it's also diverse voices as we start to think about other countries. I do a lot of work in Brazil. And one of the things about Brazil that's an interesting place is Brazil, in terms of diversity, especially racial diversity, tremendous diversity. And in fact, one of the most aggressive affirmative action programs you've ever seen in the world. I mean, literally every state has to balance every program within that state to what the population looks like in terms of racial diversity. But as we start to think about a place like Stanford, that's making actually sizable investments in bringing Brazilian students onto campus because we want their perspective, we really want them there. It's not just that we need to think about diversity of the students who are coming from the United States, but also trying to think about that diversity that's coming from Brazil. And how can we really empower groups that have been traditionally underpowered or underrepresented in those groups? How do we empower them to really be in a place where they can be part of the future of Brazil and be the leaders?
Which goes right back to this conversation around success, right? So if you recruit and you bring students from Brazil or any place else, how do you make sure they're really part of the community when they get there, right?
And that brings us full circle back to where we started. And I think that that's also one of the things, as you're thinking about your new responsibilities, is going to be front and center. Now we're having a candid conversation in front of everyone here. But I mean, like, as you start
Maybe
to
we should have spent some time before we went live on catching up, but we'll catch up in public. Here we go.
But I think the hard part, though, is going across the campus and starting to think about Where are the students who don't feel like they're part of the campus? Where are the students who really, if we found a way to, I've always felt like one of the things that makes a great president is somebody who really understands that the student experience is front and center. I mean, it is what, as a business, as you're selling, it's also the thing that you're investing so that you have a future of alumni who care about and love and become part of this family. And that's, I think, one of the hardest parts. It's not just every student at some point feels alone. How do we make sure that we're not systematically putting some students in a position where they feel alone?
No, I appreciate that's, it's only been 3 months, but my colleagues have heard me say the word community a lot. Matter of fact, somebody even today stopped me and said, "You're using community a lot." What does that really mean, right? And I said this, I think, yesterday in the faculty meeting, like, I want to make sure everybody understands I don't mean community like Disneyland Bluebirds, right? I don't mean community like we're going to all hold hands and sing a song on the quad. I'm talking about the work you're talking about, which is really seeing and hearing and valuing each other, right? To make sure that no one is alone. And you know me well enough. It's not about checking boxes. Matter of fact, we can talk about diversity and equity inclusion work in this light, but I've said this to my colleagues, checking the box almost feels offensive to me because it feels like it's just a transaction. And as educators, it's not about the transactions, it's about the relationships, right? It's about doing the work, the good stuff, and you and I have done this a lot together. This is one of the reasons why I love you so much. We've done the work together, right? We've been in the trench together. We've struggled with it together. We've done that. To me, that's community, right? There are hard choices we're going to have to make on this campus. There's trust we need to rebuild. There's all sorts of good stuff ahead of us. I'm not afraid of it, but it means we're going to have hard conversations together. We're going to have to get in there together. We're going to have to trust, shared governance. Like, we're going to have to do the work, right? And I'm all in. Like, I'm game, but when I mean community, that's what I mean by community. And I think when you think about student experience, you also have to do the work, right? You can't just say, "Come to campus." You have to then lean in and do the work, right?
I mean, one of the hardest. I think that's a hard part, and it's a hard part. It's a hard part in any campus you go to, because Stanford hired me to do specific things, right? As I think about the way the incentives are there. The incentives are for me to be productive, for me to do world-class research studies, for me to try to get the best publications I possibly can. And in many respects, I view that as my job. Now, I actually value my teaching quite a bit, and I feel like that's an important part because that's what drew me to the profession initially. I don't know if that's a universal thing that people want, in that oftentimes, if our incentive systems aren't around kind of rewarding good teaching, and not just good teaching, but good mentoring, it becomes hard on the other side. And so part of it is, how do people come in and as you look across the faculty, oftentimes depending on when we were hired and what our experiences were, we feel like the expectations are different. And one of the hard parts that you've got, and one of the challenge, is to align all of those incentives and those expectations in meaningful ways. I think one of the hardest parts that I have is oftentimes, sometimes we say that sacrifice can bring, opportunities. But oftentimes, the hard part about sacrifice is it's not a sacrifice when I give one of the shirts in my closet that I haven't worn in 2 years to Goodwill. When I give something that's valuable to me. And the number one thing that's valuable to me as a faculty member is my time. Yep. And what's hard is, as we start to think about the role that we have in really helping students, it requires sacrifice. It requires us giving up some time and recognizing that maybe I might have, over the next couple of years, one fewer publication than I would have liked, or one fewer project. And part of it, especially once you have tenure, is you're a stakeholder, you're a stockholder in that. And so part of it is the institution's future and successes are your successes, and how do you internalize that?
No, I mean, you're pointing on something that I've already had a number of our colleagues talk to me about, right? This tension between teaching, research, service, right? Those three, yeah. and kind of the pull there. And we also have a colleague, you met her earlier today when we were, you met her 20 minutes ago when we were walking over here. Jamila did a study on kind of, and I love, again, you there was no pre-read, so you don't know what I'm about to say, but she did a study on invisible work, right? So you also are pointing at the invisible work, right? The work that faculty members do it's the sacrifice work, right? And we know that that also lands on certain faculty members more than it lands on others, or that certain faculty members feel the need to sacrifice or step in that way, and that leads to that invisible work.
One of the things I've had multiple experiences where one of our students or multiple of our students are going through some hard times, especially during COVID. I mean, we've had a number of our students who've lost family members. And what's been interesting to me is when I find out about situations, I often will reach out, hey, how are you doing with this? And what's interesting is, I'm doing okay. I've been working with my advisor. And when I hear that, it's like, thank you for that advisor who decided that this was family. Yep. And I think one of the things that I've actually changed, so one of the roles I play at Stanford is I'm the area chair. We don't really have departments in the School of Education, so it's kind of like a department, but it has a little bit less authority. We don't want to give up authority. We'd like to have a nice centralized organization there. But in the chair meetings, I mean, one of the things that we've changed is we start our meetings by just saying, let's have a mental health check-in. And one of the things we do is we have a mental health check-in about how each of us are doing, but also about how our students are doing. And I don't know if we're going to keep that up. I hope we do, because I think it's made our faculty think more about that part of the job, that invisible work, the check-ins that are happening to make sure that students are really there, that they're succeeding, that they feel good about themselves, that they feel like they can do it. And I think that no matter where you're at, no matter what campus, especially as we're trying to kind of return to some type of normal, I think this weighs on students' minds tremendously.
Well, and what you're pointing at, back to the community word, is we're actually an ecosystem too, right? And holding up our colleagues in campus life, in student affairs, right? In all these spaces, that it's not, we're not as siloed as maybe it feels like someday. Our students are actually experience a whole network, and so is the ecosystem activated in ways where we're all kind of rowing together and support those students. Again, I think about, sometimes we like to do faculty staff. The reality is it's really faculty staff, right? We're all in this together, and how we kind of lift those students together and coordinate that work together is important.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to kind of step up and defend our faculty autonomy a little bit.
Yeah, no, go for it.
In that I do feel like there's an element where, as faculty members, there's kind of a unique place that you do have in most of that. Now, if you view, as a faculty member, if you fail to recognize that the only reason you can succeed in the classroom is because everybody else is putting in their time, everybody else is making sacrifices, then you're missing something. And you're missing something that could be actually very valuable to you. On the flip side of that, as you start to think about what's going to drive innovation and things like that, part of what we're also trying to do is figure out how to reach each of those students where they're at. I have to tell you two experiences.
Yep.
One of them is relevant for you, but the other one is just reminiscing. I mean, part of the reason I'm an economist was because I had a wonderful professor, Larry Wimmer, who I was taking his class, and I wasn't doing very well. It's my first economics class, and I remember just going in to see him. And I just said, look, I see myself as an A student, and I'm not performing that way in your class. And I'd really, love to know if there's some way I can get a chance here to show you that. And Larry said, look, I'll tell you what, you ace my final, I'm giving you an A in the class, and you and I are gonna have some more conversations. And that was before email and everything else. And over Christmas, I got a little Post-it note it was just a Post-it note in an envelope. And it said, come see me. We need to talk. You're gonna be an economics major. And you got your A. And it was just such a touching thing. Now, honestly, I don't know if I actually aced that test or not. But what I know is that this faculty member did something that was so far out of the box that it was clear it made a difference in my life. And I had a subsequent class from him, which was, I was willing to, do whatever he asked for in that class because I knew that he cared about my education. And I want to tell you one other one, which also goes back to assimilation, which is just a funny story, which is, so, when I started school, I was really lonely. We didn't talk a little bit about my background, but I was the fifth of 13 kids. My mom had 5, my stepdad had 8, and we grew up on welfare in rural Oregon. And of the 13, I was the 5th, but the first one to go to college. And I got to college, and that's back when long distance calls actually cost something. There was no email, and kids are getting care packages from home, letters from home, calls from home, and I'm not hearing anything because we just didn't have the money. And so I finally walked into the president's office one day, and I typed out this letter: "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Monette," because his step parents. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Monette, please write your son Eric. He needs letters from home. Sincerely, Rex Lee, president, of the university." And so I took it up to his secretary, and I just said, see if the president might be willing to sign this and send this to my parent. I even brought out like a stamped envelope for him to put it in, right? And what was so great was he put it on his letterhead, and then he wrote this nice note below it, and he sent it to my parents. Well, it turns out he made a grammatical mistake at the bottom, so my mom finally calls me, and she says, "I can't believe you stole the president's stationery." But the fun part about that was I said, well, I really didn't, and it was one of those things where the president, when I was an undergraduate, he wasn't just president, he wasn't just running things, he was also doing some of that invisible work as well. Yeah. He was, that letter to my parents made such a difference to me because it said, and so he died of cancer many years ago, and I've gone back to the university. They have a kind of like a charity run with his name on it. And I've done the run because I feel like I somehow owe him for some of my experience. And part of when I think about what I want to accomplish as a faculty member, I look back at some of that invisible work. I look at Larry Wimmer's Post-it note, at Rex Lee's letter to my parents, and I say to myself, there's some intangibles that really matter to help students build success.
That's why we're all here.
Yeah.
That's why we're all here. No, it's why we're all here. And like I said, I'm honored to be at a place where that's what our faculty do, right? So it's why Lafayette? I'm surrounded by people that do that. So Josh, we've got some questions, huh? Great.
So perhaps there's someone in the audience that may wish to ask a question if you would go to a microphone, but in the meantime, I have received a few questions from the live stream that would be great. Focusing on some of the themes, President Hurd, you mentioned, kind of the difference between access and inclusion. And so one of the questions was specifically related to that, about how does higher education ensure not only access, meaning financial aid, but also full inclusion, study abroad, food security, things of that nature.
You want to take a stab at that?
Well, one of the hard parts is we start to think about, one of the things that came up in my class today was the diverse set of challenges that students face. And what's hard is it's hard for us to basically diagnose it from a high level and for us to kind of systematically create specific programs that might have broad impact, because oftentimes the group that need that specific program is very small. But what we do need is ways that we can figure out what those needs are so we can try to allocate those in efficient ways. And that's much more difficult than it sounds, because essentially we almost need some portal where students have a relationship of trust that they're willing to, in some sense, reveal some of the details about their lives and about their insecurities that they don't want their peers to know about, that they don't want other people to judge them by. But yet they recognize that it's enough of a barrier that they can try to get the help. So it's hard because we need, it's multifaceted. We have to find a way to get students to have confidence, but then we also have to have that portal to somehow help students then. So if it's a financial issue, we can go to financial. If it's a food security issue, we can try to think about what resources we have there. If it's about ability to perform in class and ability to develop study habits, we can point them in the right place. And one of the hardest parts that we do in academics is oftentimes we build great student services, but it's kind of like the field of dreams. If we build it, they will come, and they don't. And we have to find some way of kind of finding a way to bring it to where we can bring those issues to the forefront, to have thoughtful discussions about them. This is a problem at every campus that we have. I mean, one of the truly difficult things we have is to make somebody go from being a high school student who's highly integrated in their community there, who loves their community here, to come here and suddenly be a little fish in a big pond where they used to be a big fish in a little pond, and to somehow help them find that identity that's going to help them both be successful here, but also really set them up for the future.
Thank you. So a pair of kind of interrelated questions from one person asking about basically issues with enrollments at small schools and whether or not you foresee in the marketplace the closing of some schools. A parallel question to that was about, from another person, issues of cost containment and how that might be achieved and who might lead the effort to try to do cost containment.
So those are great issues. The cost containment one, if we were to go back and rewind the clock, a decade ago, those were just dirty words in education. I mean, there was not. I mean, one of the things that as we start to think about it is, where do we become streamlined? And this is painful. I mean, at Stanford, we like good recessions because it's one of the places where we can have painful discussions about these things. But as you start to kind of move forward, it's one of the things that helping individual departments and or schools and or units start to understand that they're part of that system and that there is some type of accountability in terms of the cost that they have. It's hard. I wish I had a magic way to do this. When Larry Summers was at Harvard, this was one of the things that he tried to take on across Harvard to try to consolidate spending to actually get some cost efficiencies, if you can say that in the same word as Harvard ever. But this is an issue that everybody faces, how the cost containment. And we've traditionally been in a sector where the kind of Bowen's rules of we all want to be as prestigious as possible, so we raise as much money as we can and we spend as much money as we can, and it just is an never-ending cycle. And this is one of the places where the reality is we have to change that. And going to the first part of the question about you have to think about the financial health of the institution. And so if we have campuses that don't have a good revenue base and are completely dependent on tuition revenue, but their enrollments are declining, we're in trouble. We've got to find a diversified base of resources to help us. And this isn't just a problem at small liberal arts colleges. I mean, community colleges and public institutions where public investment is declining in terms of kind of appropriations that used to go there, they're facing the same crunch. And oftentimes they're in even worse shape than other schools because legislatively there's caps on what they can do in terms of tuition revenue. And so one of the things is really, as an organization, as a sector, we need to think about where is the new revenue sources that we're going to start to develop that are going to help us if we wind up in a position where the changing nature of the marketplace makes it to where we have some threats to our enrollment.
Mm-hmm. And so perhaps a related question from our Vice President for Enrollment, Greg McDonald.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for joining us and helping us kick off a historic week in the history of the college. The enrollment manager in me wants to ask about the changes announced last week with the College Board and the CSS profile, but I'm not sure if that will be as interesting to the rest of the group. So the community member in me wants to ask, what should we know about Nicole?
I did not know that question was coming.
Well, I think that one of the things that I've always liked in the way that she ran the College Advising Corps was principles came before product. And what I mean by that is we would often start meetings that had the potential to be contentious. And I loved how she would start it by thinking more about how do we approach this from a principle point of view? What are the virtues? What are the kind of community values that are going to govern the conversation that we're about to have? And for example, you've used the word family and community many different times in the different questions and in our conversation today. And I think that was one of the things that reflects the values. That when I think Nicole's belief, at least in the College Advising Corps, and based on my conversation so far with you all as well, is that when you come to an organization, that organization in many ways becomes your family, your community. It doesn't mean you're not going to have disagreements. It doesn't mean you're not going to have hard conversations, but it means that there should be certain values that come in and how you're going to manage those conversations so that they become opportunities as a group rather than as stumbling blocks that eventually become divisive. So I think that that was one of the things that I just admired in the way that she's led the organization. I think the other thing that I really liked that she would ground conversations. You know, in the College Advising Corps, you had Nicole, you had her kind of national staff and her board, you had this group of program directors, and then you even had the counselors, and then you had the students. And so if you think about that distance between where she was as the leader and where the students that she was serving at, one of the things I admired was that she always tried to make it to where not only did we talk about values, but we also tried to talk about experience. That the experience that mattered most was what the student experience was in that group. And so the nice thing about that was it not only helped us start to think about the value that would govern our conversation, but it also made it very clear that the mission was not about growing this program or developing a new arm here or something else. The mission was really centered around the student. Now afterwards, we can talk about CSS profile and the College Board some more. That'd be a great conversation. I think there's some interesting, I think it's more interesting kind of how the College Board's being forced to kind of change as we see more and more colleges divesting themselves of college entrance exams, but happy to talk later about those. I get excited about those conversations.
Just for the record, I think it was my second conversation with Nicole. She was asking me about when will the CSS profile be reformed? So ahead of the curve.
Well, look, I haven't changed at all. I'm the same person, right? I've gone from the College Advising Corps to Lafayette, but I'm still Nicole. So, and so yeah, I mean, I think my first conversation with Greg was about like, how do we knock down barriers, right? What are the barriers to Lafayette? Are they the same barriers, which I assume they are, but I wanted to make sure the students that we were working with at College Advising Corps, you know, can we articulate those barriers? How do we knock them down? How do we make sure that we recruit a diverse, thoughtful group of students and make sure that we can deliver on that student experience? And yeah, the CSS profile is a problem, right? And so I think, and again, now we're getting into jargon, so for those of you that are not in the admission space, but you know, this is another way, and I'll say this loud, and if my friend David Coleman's listening, hey David, I'm coming after your CSS profile right now, which is, no, it's not okay to make low-income families prove over and over and over again that they're low income, right? This is just not okay. We've got something it happens sometimes when we work with certain populations where we love to make them prove over and over and over again things we know, right? So if you're in a high population free reduced lunch school, why are we going to have to make you prove 20 times that you're in a high free and reduced lunch school, right? And what bothers me is it's demoralizing, right? It's not okay for us to put a burden on people who are trying to access education to verify, and you know, now I'll really get into it. FAFSA, I mean, who gets flagged for verification? It's low-income, first-generation, and underrepresented students, right? You've worked in this space. Yeah. The financial aid system is actually broken in lots of ways, but it's broken in ways that hurt our low-income students the most, right? And so now you've got me going, Greg, but I will say I have every intention of working with my colleagues here and holding hands to make sure that we don't make people continue to prove something that we should believe that they want to come here and they've already proven once, right?
One of the things, just talking about, you kind of returning a little bit to the research I've done, one of the things that I've tried to do in the different work that I've done is try to think about where artificial barriers exist. If we've created a barrier because of a process that we've created that's made it difficult for some students to navigate, unless we really have a purpose for why that complexity should be there, we can wind up kind of creating barriers where we really need bridges. Now, the hard part is, you know, this is me trying to be the academic and play a little bit of devil's advocate, right? If there's a certain amount of complexity that may not be bad for the system, in that it does, if a student can't deal with some complexity, how are they going to ever write a complex term paper or something? But as I've done work and tried to, you know, that was kind of how I came into it thinking initially, and we've been able to kind of break some barriers, like I'm thinking about, you mentioned FAFSA simplification at the very beginning. The student success that happened there, we didn't see just a momentary success that suddenly they were able to get to college, but they didn't know how to navigate it. I think that there's oftentimes a different set of skills around things like managing income and finances that oftentimes low-income individuals have to do kind of prematurely relative to the rest of the population. The rest of the population, we're oftentimes trying to train them a little bit more, and part of the college experience is learning how to live with a budget, learning how to actually manage your finances. And one of the hard parts with low-income students is it's not just that they're managing their own finances oftentimes, it's that they're also managing their home finances as well. My frustration on the FAFSA started when I first went to college. I remember taking the FAFSA in to my stepdad saying, hey, here's this great form. It's going to get me some financial aid. It'll make it to where I don't have to work as much. And he said, I'm not telling the government anything. And it was like, okay, thanks. And I got my job and I was able to pay the bills. But again, that's, we oftentimes put these burdens and kind of artificial barriers. Look, we were on free reduced lunch at that point. We were receiving, welfare benefits. But yet I still needed to go through and do this complex form that I couldn't get cooperation from. It was really frustrating in the time.
So being mindful of the time, there have been many great questions. Perhaps two more. Professor Stiefel.
Hi, Eric, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I have two kind of unrelated questions. The first one is related to international students. You talked about them as being a source of revenue. One of the things I am proud of Lafayette about is that we provide full funding to international students with need. And if you could speak a bit about that group of students as well, not as a source of revenue, but what they might contribute. Then my second question is about merit aid. So as a parent of kids who went through the application process not so recently, seen a lot of high quality institutions providing merit aid to attract students who are not necessarily of need. Just what your take is on that. Is that just one of our instruments that we use to craft a diverse class every year, or what are the trade-offs with that and financial aid?
Sure. So let me try to answer the first one, okay, and try to draw on whatever anthropology I can from my life, and let me try to answer the second one as an economist a little bit more. I think that I can really just speak to my experience with that, and the two experiences I think I've had on kind of internationalization type issues. One of the things that I drew a rough assignment at Stanford. One semester I was appointed to be the faculty in residence in Florence, Italy. And that was a rough assignment. But the place that was interesting was the perspective we had. So one of the classes I taught was about the euro, and kind of what the future of the European Union was. And then as we started to see threats to the euro coming as the high unemployment and high debt ratios that we had talked about from a theoretical point in class really started to become the reality, these students were writing me and just saying, wow, living in that experience and seeing the way that Italy approached its problems has just changed the way that I think. Now my experience is, kind of going back was, I actually got involved with Brazilian students way back. I think I was 19 when I started had my first pão de queijo, the famous cheese bread. And one of the things that has been interesting is the set of issues and the set of problems that students face. For example, many of my Brazilian friends lived through hyperinflation. The first bus, my first time ever in Brazil, I took a bus that was back in the Cruzeiro, it was 50 Cruzeiros. And 18 months later, it was 50,000 Cruzeiros. It's a country where they've impeached 2 different presidents. It's a country where, as you think about kind of where it's at right now and the leadership and the turmoil and the discussions that are going on there, the students who are living and have been in that experience have experienced a very different political situation than I have. And one of the things that I think it helps us to sometimes contextualize the depth of our problems as we start to think about it. I was once in a meeting with a couple of their Stanford professors, and they were asking us what we think the biggest pressing issue is. And one of my colleagues said, I think it's diversity. And I don't disagree that diversity is an enormous issue for us in the United States. I think if you were to think globally on this question, it might be a slightly different, a very different answer. Because right now the provision of higher education throughout most of our developing countries is very uneven and much more unequal than what we have in the United States. And so I think that it helps you both contextualize your own problems, but also recognize that there might be solutions and answers in other places. It also helps you understand that the world is a lot more similar, and the similarities between many of our systems are much greater than we might think about. So on the first question, I just feel like there's an added sense of perspective that students get in that international. And part of what we want is we want our students to be able to compete in the world that's coming. And if we think we're going to be in a world where borders are even more open than they've ever been, or where we'll have international conflict and we need to try to find points of similarity, points of conversation where we can start a dialogue, we need to have those perspectives. Now, on the other question is trying to think a little bit about merit aid and trying to understand the role that merit aid plays. And I think that there's a couple of things here. I mean, this is where I'm going to give you a very economics-y answer here, which is this is that place where we struggle, where in higher education, students are inputs and outputs. And we want our students at the end of the day to be successful. That's what we're trying to help them do. But, like in my class today, when I'm teaching it, at some point I almost want to just be quiet and just let them talk. Because as soon as we really kind of I gave them the background information and they started to discuss it, things became organic. There was learning going on, and I was part of it. You might say I was kind of making sure the boat was still going downstream, but the strength of the current was coming from the students, not from me. And one of the things I think that is powerful as you start to think about it is, as you start to think about crafting a diverse class, I think a class would be utterly boring if every person was Einstein coming in. Well, it might be fascinating to watch, but in terms of the diversity of experience and perspectives that students get, I think we want a group of students, we want a couple of Einsteins, we want a couple of students who are just fantastic athletes, we want a couple of students who have been through tremendous obstacles in their life to make it there, because they give us that sense of perspective that start to help us as a group have that synergistic of effect that comes from a peer effect. So part of it is, from an economist point of view, is I look at merit aid sometimes as being the wage that we're paying students, because we want some of the unique experience and talents that they have, because we think they're going to make our other students better. And I'm willing to even pay a wage to them to have them come and share those perspectives with us. But I almost expect that there's a duty on their side to provide those perspectives, because that's part of the reason why we wanted the merit aid, because they had that preparation and we want them to be able to share that. So I hope those, I don't know if I always worry that somehow I'm either departing from economics too much on the first question and being too much part of economics and thinking this as production functions in the second part. But I think that they both come back to that kind of the saliency of peers to provide perspective and to prepare us for a future.
Thank you.
So one final question for you. So from someone watching the live stream, Dr. Bettinger, specifically about the research you've conducted, has there been a specific aha moment you can think of that has really changed the sort of advice you give, perhaps directly to prospective students, maybe to organizations trying to increase access, or the colleges, universities receiving these students, something that really kind of like your research has, really opened your eyes?
Ooh. This one's tough because I'm kind of like a lighthouse. And when I'm shining in one direction, that is so fascinating. And then as soon as I move the lighthouse a little bit, I see something else and I'm really excited. And it takes me oftentimes a long time to get back to where I was, as that lighthouse is kind of moving around. But I think there's a few different places I think that were kind of be big themes in the work that I've done that get me excited. I love it when organizations set themselves up to learn from themselves. And in the research I've done, when I get to do a research study and the individuals around who are really at the front line look at the research and say, wow, this helps me become better, there's a tremendous satisfaction. I sometimes joke the perverse world that academics can be sometimes, that, probably the most influential study I had was about FAFSA simplification. And so I have a line on my Vita about this paper I published on FAFSA simplification. I almost would love to put that other line, because of FAFSA simplification, these are the extra number of kids who've been able to go to college every year since 2012, right? I'd love to be able to somehow, I don't know that we could fully attribute those to my work, but the point is, there's a service that came there, and there's a satisfaction that kind of makes it to where when you're doing research, you really realize that research has the potential to make somebody's life better. So maybe rather than give you a list of different things, I think that's probably the one that's the most salient for me, is that moment when you realize that a small piece of your research can really make somebody's life better. It's a great feeling. It might be a line on my Vita. I may not even be able to put that line that I made somebody's life better, but there's a tremendous satisfaction that comes from that.
Thank you. President Hurd, any final comments?
No, I mean, I don't think you could have ended any better, because you went exactly back to my introduction, which is you have made my life better. And there's no doubt that the 525,000 students that we got to put through the National Student Clearinghouse together would not have landed in higher education without your guidance and your research. And I think everybody's seen it. I use this phrase a lot. You radiate intelligence and empathy, but you also radiate love and light. And I'm very grateful that we've been on this journey together. And now you're part of the Lafayette family too. So
you see this, you bring it all back to values and about mission. So
it's all about values and missions. It's all about students and impact, right? That's why we're all here. So welcome to the Lafayette family, Eric. We will have you back. I will share with everybody. Every year I go out to teach Eric's class for a section. He came to UVA, well actually we did on Zoom to teach my class last spring. So we'll get you back to campus and have you enjoy this amazing place even more. But welcome to our Lafayette family, Eric. Thanks for coming out, and thank you for being part of Inauguration. And to our colleagues here in Colton Chapel, thank you for spending the evening with us. And to our colleagues online, thank you for joining us that way. But Eric, thank you. I'm very grateful for you.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Bettinger and President Hurd, for such a wonderful conversation. Thank you for everyone for attending, and for those who joined us in the live stream, and the wonderful questions that came in. I just regret that there wasn't time to go through more of them. For those of you who might be interested in seeing, rewatching a part of this live stream, the recording will be made available and announced on a future edition of Lafayette Today. Otherwise, I look forward to everyone joining us on Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. On the quad for the installation of our 18th president, Nicole Hurd. Thank you.